Hello, everybody, and welcome to Prenatal Diagnosis and the Future of Down Syndrome. What I hope will be a very fruitful discussion, and a discussion that I'm very much looking forward to today, with some people who I think have some really great insights to share. This conversation is co-sponsored by the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America and the National Catholic Partnership on Disability. My name is J.D. Flynn, and I'll be your host today. And again, I'm just so grateful that you joined us. Thank you so much for being here with us. The Institute for Human Ecology, located at the Catholic University of America, is an interdisciplinary institute dedicated to bringing the riches of the Catholic intellectual tradition to bear in contemporary conversations, just like the one we'll have today. The National Catholic Partnership on Disability works collaboratively to ensure meaningful participation for persons with disabilities in church and society. The NCPD and the IHE, which are both great organizations, have a long-standing partnership for planning disability events that pertain to the life of the church. Today, we're very blessed. If you're participating with us and you need to avail yourself of it, CART captioning is available and ASL is available as well. You can see our ASL interpreter on your screen now. As we talk, we will have a time at the end for questions and answers, but as we talk, if questions come to you and you'd like to have them asked at the end or even during the course of our discussion, you can type them into the Q&A box. If you just click close to where you see the chat link, you'll see a little button that says Q&A, and you can just click there and then type in your questions, and we'll monitor those and introduce them into our conversation as we go. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. And if we can, let's begin with prayer, and we'll pray a prayer from the NCPD, a prayer to St. Joseph, whose solemnity we celebrate today for families. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. O glorious St. Joseph, to you God committed the care of his only begotten Son amid the many dangers of this world. We come to you and we ask you to take under your special protection the children God has given us. Through holy baptism, they become children of God and members of his holy church. We consecrate them to you today, that through this consecration they may become your foster children. Guard them, guide their steps in life, form their hearts after the hearts of Jesus and Mary. Saint Joseph, patron saint of families, pray for us. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, again, if you're just joining us, and I can see that participants are still kind of making their way into the chat, if you're just joining us, please, again, let me introduce to you our panelists for our conversation today on prenatal diagnosis and the future of Down syndrome. First, and the first person who I think we'll hear from today is Dr. Mary O'Callaghan, who serves on the governing board of the National Catholic Partnership on Disability and also as the chair of the Ethics and Public Policy Committee of the NCPD. She is a developmental psychologist who has worked as a public policy fellow at the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture at Notre Dame since 2015, focusing primarily on the issue of disability-selective abortion. She has also been involved in state legislative efforts to protect infants with disabilities. Thank you so much, Mary, for being here, and welcome.
Thank you, JD.
Bridget Brown is a disability pro-life advocate, a national speaker and writer, and a young woman with Down syndrome. Bridget serves on the NCPD's Committee on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. She advocates for inclusion and the meaningful participation of persons with disabilities in parish life. Bridget has met Pope Francis and has written him a letter expressing her concerns regarding disability-selective abortion. Bridget, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Great. Tracy Windsor is the co-founder of Be Not Afraid, a case management support service for parents carrying to term following a prenatal diagnosis. Tracy has presented and written extensively on the topic of prenatal diagnosis, including presentations for the U.S. bishops, the National Catholic Partnership on Disability, the International Association of Catholic Nurses, and the Catholic Social Workers, the Catholic Social Workers National Association. Tracy, thank you so much for being here. We're so grateful.
My privilege. Thank you.
Great. Now we'll get started with all of our panelists in just a minute. If you're just joining us again, you're at Prenatal Diagnosis and the Future of Down Syndrome. We'll have time for discussion with all of our panelists and experts. And if you have questions that occur to you or things you want to share, you can just post them in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll get to them, and we'll read them and introduce them into the conversation. But obviously, the topic that we're talking about today, I just want to sort of set the stage for just a minute if we can. The topic that we're talking about today, prenatal diagnosis and the future of Down syndrome, is something that I think is important to all of us who are participating in this webinar. Some of us personally, some of us professionally, some of us as educators or pastors and priests, or as ethicists, or others who are concerned with the question of how people with disabilities are regarded in our society. Of course, we know that the foundation of the protection of the rights of all human persons begins in the womb, and that's especially true for people with disabilities who face, after a prenatal diagnosis, often the prospect of abortion. I think Bridget will probably talk with us, or excuse me, I think Mary will probably talk with us a little bit more about what data is available. But we know that data is hard to come by on this subject. It's hard to get reliable numbers about this. It's hard to know exactly how broad and how pervasive the problem is. But we know that it exists, that when a woman receives a prenatal diagnosis of a disability in the United States, she often faces tremendous pressure, external and internal pressure, often to undergo an abortion. And oftentimes our medical establishment can even sort of treat that as the status quo expectation, which I suspect Tracy will talk with us a great deal about. We know, of course, that in Europe, Iceland was sort of featured prominently in the news, a CBS News report a couple of years ago, and other countries have reported as well that the frequency with which individuals with Down syndrome are encountered in society, or the population of individuals with Down syndrome, is on the decline. And the reason for that decline is because of the pervasiveness of diagnosis-selective abortion. And that's a poverty. I think all of us know, as Pope Francis has talked about, that it's a poverty to live in a sort of sterilized and homogenized society in which we don't have the opportunity to encounter people with differences, with intellectual differences, with genetic differences, people who can enrich our lives by their friendship and by their contribution to our community, and by our experience of sharing as Christians in the common bonds of baptism in the body of Christ. So there's a poverty, of course, for all of us in a culture in which disability-selective abortion becomes more prominent. But of course, that kind of abortion most acutely affects those whose lives are actually imperiled by them. So I think today we'll discuss the way in which we can help to protect the lives of children who receive a prenatal diagnosis and whose lives are put in danger by them, and of their families, who oftentimes can be denied their agency, can be denied the opportunity to understand how positively their family lives might be affected by welcoming a person with disabilities, and what kind of supports are available to them. And then I suspect we'll talk a little bit as well about what kind of social supports and structures are needed, both civically in our civil society and in our church, to better encourage families who receive prenatal diagnoses to choose life and to experience the richness and gifts of persons with disabilities in their own life. For myself, I speak to you as a father today. I have 3 children, and 2 of them have Down syndrome. My son Max is 12 and a 6th grader at our parish school, St. Mary's School, and he has Down syndrome and some other neurological disabilities as well. My daughter Pia is 11 and a 5th grader at St. Mary's, and she has Down syndrome as well. And I can say that knowing and loving people with disabilities as a father, but just in the experience of knowing and loving them, has been one of the most enriching experiences of my life. And one of the most profoundly transformative experiences of my life, especially in better understanding the profound loving goodness of God our Father, to have the experience of seeing and knowing and loving my own children in their disabilities, seeing the things which come from that, which are challenges and crosses from them, and seeing the ways in which their disabilities also have enriched their lives, has given me a much deeper appreciation, I think, for the way in which God our Father sees each of us and loves us. So many of us on this call, I think, are blessed with the experience of knowing and loving people with disabilities, and I suspect we'll be able to talk a little bit about that as well today. Again, if you have questions during our discussion, you can just put them into the Q&A box down at the bottom. We're going to start with some questions for our panelists, and perhaps there will be some interchange between them and some exchange between us of some good thoughts. But we'll start with Mary O'Callahan. Mary, the U.S. Bishops' Conference right now is in the process of redrafting their pastoral statement on disability, the 1978 pastoral statement on persons with disability. And so much has changed since 1978 in terms of the way that we talk about and think about and engage with people who have disabilities, in terms of the way that people with disabilities advocate for themselves, and in terms of the way that we think about inclusion, especially in the structures of our church. So what has changed in the area of prenatal diagnosis since the pastoral statement in 1978? How is the landscape different now than it was then? And what does that mean for children with Down syndrome?
Absolutely. Thank you, JD. Of course, Down syndrome is not the only diagnosis given prenatally, but since it's the most common of the chromosomal conditions that we can detect in utero, it's been kind of a barometer, right, of of prenatal diagnosis in general. And so the history of prenatal testing is very much tied up with the history of Down syndrome in our country within the last 60 years or so. And there's truly been a sea change, right? A profound transformation in prenatal diagnosis since 1978. So let's go back in time a little bit. At that time, Roe had only been the law of the land for about 5 years. I would say that at that time, the attitude of the medical community, at least formally, was already on the side of abortion in the case of Down syndrome and other disabilities. In fact, as far back as 1967, the American Medical Association passed a resolution endorsing abortion in these cases. In addition, in 1978, as I've said, abortions for this reason would have been legal, and the technology was also available, right, to screen for at least chromosomal anomalies. However, this practice wasn't yet widespread. It would actually take 2 lawsuits, one in 1978 and one in 1979, to change this. In both of these, parents successfully sued their doctors for medical malpractice for failing to advise amniocentesis. Both women were over 35, and incidentally, both women went on to give birth to beautiful little girls with Down syndrome. But as a direct result of these lawsuits, there was a major change, which was that in 1983, ACOG, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, officially recommended prenatal screening for all women over 35. So there was an increase, right, an uptake in testing at this time. This policy held steady for about 25 years. It was a year, 2007, in my opinion, which was incidentally the year my own son, Tommy, was born with Down syndrome. 2007 was the watershed year, I think, for prenatal diagnosis. It heralded a number of even more significant changes. And so first of all, in 2007, ACOG changed their guidelines to recommend screening for all pregnant women, right? Not just those over the age of 35. And this was based on the fact that even though women over the age of 35 are more likely to conceive a child with chromosomal problems, statistically, the majority of infants with Down syndrome and other conditions are actually born to younger mothers just because they're having more children. And so this new recommendation cast a much wider net, if you will, right? And so the potential for destruction of lives of children with Down syndrome became much greater. JD just referred to kind of our sort of uncertain estimates of the incidence of of abortion of these children in our country. Our best estimates are between 70 and 90% once a definitive diagnosis has been given, right? And so if we increase, right, our diagnostic capacity, if we're testing more mothers, then we are going to lose more lives of these children if the abortion rate stays about the same. The second major change that we saw happened a few years later in 2011. The first non-invasive early blood test to detect Down syndrome and other trisomies was announced. These are sometimes called NIPS or NIPT. They're also called cell-free DNA tests, so you might have heard them referred to as under one of those names. And the reason that these tests were such a game changer was that these were hailed as diagnostic tests. So if you're about my age, you know that prior to this, the protocol for most women was that a blood test was administered to screen for any potential problems at about 16 weeks. If this indicated a heightened risk, right, then a more definitive but invasive test, such as an amniocentesis, was offered, right? So this invasive testing carries a risk of miscarriage. And so what they were offering here was a non-invasive diagnostic test. Not only would it be risk-free, but it could be administered much earlier in pregnancy. So potentially much greater uptake, right, of the test because no risk was associated, and a test that could be given earlier in pregnancy. And in fact, I think in general, these tests mark the advent of earlier screening, beginning in the first trimester instead of the second, which also has implications for abortions. Earlier diagnosis may make abortions easier to obtain, either because of legal limits or even personal reluctance for later abortions. It's important to note that these tests did not entirely deliver on the promise of a diagnostic test. They are not as accurate as they were marketed to be. So currently, ACOG recommends them as a screening test, but also recommends that they be given to all pregnant women. And so despite the fact that they are or should be used as screening tests, there's a lot of confusion among parents, I believe, about how accurate they are, and likely some of them view them as equivalent to diagnostic tests. So this is problematic. There tends to be false positives with this test, which seem to be related to maternal factors, not infant factors. And so we may get women who abort based on this information alone. So, to answer your question, JD, taken as a whole, the threat that prenatal testing and diagnosis poses to children with Down syndrome, I think is much more urgent than it was in 1978. Testing is more widespread, it's much earlier in pregnancy, and even if currently we don't have a risk-free blood test, some believe it's a matter of time. And in the meantime, parents are treating this test as such. And one more thing that I think we need to address, another important piece of this puzzle, is that the larger societal context in which prenatal testing takes place is also very different. When the original pastoral statement was written, right, much less was known about the potential of individuals with Down syndrome, and societal attitudes would have been less positive. So, although selective abortion at that time was still not justifiable by any means, at least it perhaps could be explained by misinformation, right, or maybe a lack of understanding. In the intervening years, legal protections, right, early intervention and educational opportunities, et cetera, have expanded greatly. And we've seen the accomplishments of individuals with Down syndrome firsthand, right? Attitudes have become more positive, for goodness sake, right? In 2018, the Gerber Baby of the Year had Down syndrome, right? So this makes it all the more troubling. I'm sorry, there go my lights, but that is those with Down syndrome are increasingly showing us their ability to flourish in the midst of families and wider society. The targeting them for selective abortion in medicine has become even more aggressive. So despite all the gains we've made in the area of disability rights, I'd say we're in a much worse place, right, with respect to abortion and Down syndrome, at least in terms of medical policy and practice. But a final piece of this is that unlike in 1978, abortion is not the law of the land, right? So right now, and we could talk about this later, legislatively, things are looking much brighter, right? Post-Roe, a number of states now have protections. So I'll stop here for now, but I think that this is kind of a summary of where we are as opposed to 1978.
Mary, I want to ask a bit more about how the Dobbs decision has changed things. But first, you mentioned the advances that people with Down syndrome have made over the intervening decades since 1978. And I wonder if you can comment on, and maybe Tracy, you can weigh in as well. Has the information made available to parents who receive a prenatal diagnosis kept up with the progress that people with Down syndrome have made?
That's an excellent question, and Tracy can probably address this too, since she works very directly in service with women. But in 2007, right, when the recommendation was made for all women to be screened for Down syndrome, this really concerned the Down syndrome community. And as a result, there was a lot of lobbying that was done. And in 2008, the bipartisan Kennedy-Brownback bill was passed. This was the pre and postnatally diagnosed information act, something along those lines. But the upshot was that accurate information, right, was supposed to be provided to all pregnant parents who would receive a diagnosis of Down syndrome. And we were hopeful about this, but this was actually, this hasn't sort of been as effective, right, in deterring these abortions as we hoped. First of all, there was very limited funding, and it's very difficult to enforce this right or to even monitor it, to know what physicians are doing. And, if you think about it, information is kind of a minimum standard, right? Of course, we should be providing information. In fact, I think it's rather an indictment of the field, right, that we had to legislate that accurate information be given parents. And so, in theory, yes, this information is available, right? In fact, there's been a number of, books and brochures and websites, et cetera, that physicians could use. But I'm not sure how well they're passing on this information to parents.
Tracy?
I don't know.
I would say a couple of things. I think in a general sense, oftentimes the conversation around any prenatal diagnosis, which obviously would include Down syndrome, is based on the idea that you want to make it as easy as possible for the parents to terminate the pregnancy if that's what they're inclined to do. That seems to be the effort that's made. And so very often across the board, without regard to diagnosis, we see kind of worst case scenario presented to parents as they look forward. That's a challenge. And I will say that we had at least one parent that we supported whose prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome was characterized to them as a severe case, which in fact you can't tell, right? It's meaningless.
Yeah.
Similarly, kind of the likelihood that parents end up engaging with their medical providers in some kind of conversation about quality of life, equally kind of meaningless in the prenatal setting, because it's really hard until you know baby to know what baby is going to do.
Right.
So these are problems. I think the other thing that happens is that there's so much testing going on. And right now, with this current generation of young parents, we're so interested in announcing is this a boy or a girl. The uptake of the genetic screen, the NIP test, or the cell-free DNA is very high without parents really even understanding that it's looking at anything beyond boy or girl. It's often offered to them as the earliest way to find out whether they need a pink or a blue nursery. And so parents are frequently blindsided. They're engaged in prenatal testing, but blindsided by the information that they receive.
What do we know about the impact upon receiving a prenatal diagnosis of having met or known or had the experience of encountering a person with that particular disability? I mean, our anthropology is incarnational. We know that knowing a person is transformative. Is there evidence that that's true for parents who receive a prenatal diagnosis?
I don't think I can cite, Mary, you might have an answer. I'm not sure that I can identify research. I do think that when you meet parents that have had some relationship within their family, some other exposure, sometimes that is helpful. Oftentimes, if the experience was a difficult one, so let's say it's a prenatal diagnosis of a complex heart defect by a cousin that ultimately resulted in a death, sometimes that can be more complicating, making it harder for them to continue the pregnancy. So it really depends. Mary, do you have any?
I would agree. I haven't seen any specific information or data on this, but I know just anecdotally, I've heard the same thing that Tracy said, that in some cases it's a plus, and in some cases, if the person with Down syndrome they knew had more difficulties, perhaps maybe they were an older family member, and so they kind of grew up in a different generation, that actually may have a negative impact. So it's really, I think, yeah, it's very variable.
And then I wonder as well. I want to start talking about the Dobbs decision, but I wonder as well, what do we know about the stratification of decision making for people in different sort of different socioeconomic statuses with regard to prenatal diagnosis? Is there any correlation between socioeconomic status and the decision that one makes after prenatal diagnosis, or how the information is received or communicated that we know about?
That's a really good question. And Tracy maybe we'll have some anecdotal data on this. What we can kind of tell in is kind of a gross way, right, is some of the studies that have looked, or the sort of meta-analysis that have looked at rates of abortion in Down syndrome are kind of interesting. And what we find is that on the East Coast, in states like Maine, maybe New Hampshire, states like that, the rates of abortion after a diagnosis are much higher. In California, they're actually much lower, and I think that's because of the Hispanic population there, which is not only primarily Catholic, but also tends to have sort of more tight-knit families. I know that at least one Hispanic mother I've worked with here was very the idea of abortion was very abhorrent to her. So this is just kind of a sort of analysis at a gross level. I don't know if there's been any more specific research done in that area.
I also am not aware of any research relative to that, but I would say that we certainly see anecdotally that if a mother is young, if English is not her first language, if there are economic difficulties being faced by a family, if there are a lot of children, I would say it certainly appears that the pressure to abort is more extreme for the parent, often by somebody who thinks that maybe it would be difficult for this family or this individual to have additional complications in their life, but not without regard, not taking into consideration the great gift that these children.
And what about Catholic identity? I know we often think about, this is something which the church must address, sort of speaking into the world, but it seems to me there's a likelihood, at least, that this is something happening to Catholics as well, that Catholic women themselves, I don't know what the likelihood is of them having an abortion after a prenatal diagnosis. Do we know very much about the incidence rates of this among self-identified Catholics?
No, although, we are always available to talk to parents that are undecided. So we are often asked to engage with parents who are trying to make a decision. And I would say in that situation, the number of parents who might abort after that conversation and the Catholic community isn't that different than the number of parents in other communities. I think the thing that is pertinent here as we consider impacts to the parent at the time of diagnosis is that we have research now that indicates that most parents experience the prenatal diagnosis as a traumatic event. And it's 83% of dads, 88% of moms. The data is a little skewed as to whether it matters how severe the diagnosis is. Is it more trauma if the baby has anencephaly? Is it less trauma if the baby has clubfoot? That part, not as clear, but it is clear that it's a traumatic event. This speaks to this whole issue of informed consent around testing, because most parents would say that the prenatal diagnosis was unexpected or shocking. And in that way, parents become vulnerable as traumatized individuals to making a decision, ultimately, that causes them moral injury when they can't live with. So there is data that suggests that that is happening.
Yeah. Tracy, I want to revisit the question of trauma in a little while. But first, Mary, we're in now the post-Dobbs universe. In 2002, Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. What has changed about selective abortion?
Certainly, the legislative landscape has changed significantly prior to Dobbs. So I think this would have been maybe the spring of 2022 was the last time I looked sort of at the current legislation. I think we had 6 states that had a ban in effect on abortion of children with disabilities, right? And all had been passed fairly recently. And at that time, there was a handful of other states, maybe 5 or 6, including my home state of Indiana, which had successfully passed such bans, but these were being held up in the courts, right, because of challenges by the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, et cetera. So right after Dobbs, it took a little while for the dust to settle. And in fact, legislation in this area is still a little bit in flux. But as it stands now, there are 20 states which don't allow abortion in the case of Down syndrome. So I think that's remarkable. This number could increase. There are currently 3 states that have passed near total bans on abortion, but these are being held up in court. We should note that 7 of the 20 states I mentioned still allow children with so-called life-limiting diagnosis. Probably a better term would be very serious medical conditions to be aborted. So we don't want to forget our brothers and sisters here. There's much work to be done still. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but there's about another 7 states that have some protections, right? Because they have gestational age limits of varying degrees, 6 weeks, 12 weeks, et cetera. And they don't allow disability abortions past these limits, right? So we've got some more states that have some degree of protection for those with Down syndrome. But this is remarkable. If you had asked me 10 years ago if it would be possible, right, for us to have 20 states with protections for children with Down syndrome throughout pregnancy, I wouldn't have believed it. Yeah. At this point, though, we don't know yet how much these state laws will impact the abortion rate, right? We have open borders between states. And so we don't know whether or not mothers will travel to other states to terminate their pregnancies. There's certainly a lot of support to do so, right? Certain companies, right, offer to pay their employees to cross state lines to get abortions. There's a number of websites that advise women on how to travel, right, and which states to travel to get abortions. And as you mentioned earlier, we don't keep good data, right, on abortions in this country. So I think it's going to take a little while for us to understand the answer to this question. And a question is really interesting, and I would be interested in Tracy's take on this as well. And I'm not sure the answer to this is whether prenatal screening will continue at the same rates in those states where these abortions are not allowed, right? For a number of these conditions right now, Down syndrome and the other trisomies, there's no sort of proven treatments in utero. And so in some sense, it wouldn't make sense, right, for prenatal screening and testing to take place at least at the same pace that it has. Although I think we could argue that there are some good reasons, right, to do prenatal testings in some circumstances. My guess is that at least for the time being, this testing will continue. I haven't really had a chance to talk to obstetricians about this yet. So I don't know, Tracy, if you've heard any word on the street, right, in terms of the states that aren't allowing abortion in the case of disability.
I think that, a lot of focus has on pro-choice community has focused a lot of advocacy in those states. So, and I would say that sometimes a state that has legislation like that, we don't find the medical community to be especially supportive of that legislation. We might find them to be really in a good deal of opposition. So we have seen private medical providers connect a mother to a foundation that will pay for her to fly out of state to have that abortion, which is something we wouldn't necessarily imagine an obstetrician in private practice to do. But that can happen, and sadly will happen often quickly, so that mother's making a decision to leave the state for this abortion in 48 or 72 hours, which is problematic.
Right. I'm not surprised at all to hear that.
Yeah, and the other thing I think is that we haven't seen any change in the uptake, particularly of the cell-free DNA test. It is world changing, and the problem is that Mary mentioned the false positive rate. The false positive rate is associated with mother's age, and it increases with the rarity of the condition. Yeah. So I think the average age for a woman giving birth in the United States right now is like 28. There's something called a NIPT calculator online where you can go in and enter the mom's age, and you can enter the diagnosis. For a woman who's 28 years old, if she receives a positive screening result of Down syndrome, there's a 44% chance that it's a false positive. That's kind of high. Yeah. And what we find in practice is that if that's a woman who says, well, wait a minute, I just thought I was going to find out if this was a boy or a girl. I didn't expect this answer. I'm not going to pursue additional testing. Then oftentimes the medical community will start responding as if that test is diagnostic. Right. She finds an amnio, now we're acting like it's diagnostic. Right. That may be less concerning when the prenatal diagnosis is Down syndrome, but if the prenatal diagnosis is trisomy 13 or trisomy 18, that can result in immediate effort to start withholding care for very basic things like fetal monitoring during labor and delivery. So cell-free DNA is really a game changer in the environment of prenatal diagnosis.
Absolutely. And what's really disturbing is that these tests are marketed directly on their websites to parents with very misleading information, and so it's really concerning.
Thank you so much for that. I want to move on to Bridget and some of the activism that she has done. But right before we do that, I want to just, Mary, lean into your expertise as a developmental psychologist just a little bit, because you mentioned the progress that people with Down syndrome have made in recent decades, and the degree to which we see a far greater degree of self-sufficiency and self-advocacy and capacity for more independence in various ways. What have we learned about intervention, early intervention, and other kinds of intervention? What are the touch points for really changing the outlook for the life of a person who has Down syndrome?
Absolutely. I think just across the board, that the therapies that we've been providing really kind of all work together. And in fact, I think what's really helpful is to kind of have a team, approach. I know for my son, we had, speech therapy, OT, PT, kind of a systemic approach, because all these children are very different, right? They come with very different gifts and strengths. And so at least I know in our case, it was very helpful. And I think it's been helpful to have kind of a team approach to early intervention. But I don't know that there is simply one thing, right? I think in some ways it's just been allowing these children to flourish, right, in family environments, which has been key, right, as opposed to institutionalization. That has been really important. So, in a sense, I think we've just really, kind of given these individuals, the space, right, and the support they needed really to do what they're able to do.
And along those lines, I'll just make a plug for something which is very near and dear to my heart, which is the degree to which children with Down syndrome can flourish in an inclusive classroom, and especially an inclusive Catholic classroom where the education and formation comes from a place that really understands the human person and what it means to flourish as a human person, and where a person with Down syndrome or other disabilities is welcomed as a full participant and a member of the class. So I'm grateful for all of the things that you mentioned, and I'd like to encourage those who are administrators or pastors out there to know that you can do it in your schools too. And I want to turn now, Bridget. We are so fortunate to have you in this conversation as we're talking about this kind of advocacy, because you are really an international advocate for people with Down syndrome who are living in the womb and for their protection. You have written to the people of Iceland. You have talked with the Pope about this. You have been on the world stage doing the work, and we're so grateful for that. Tell us about the letter that you wrote to the people of Iceland when CBS News reported about the eradication of Down syndrome in Iceland. Tell us what you did and share that letter with us, if you would.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Bridget, and the reason why I learned about what Iceland did by educating babies with Down syndrome. And so I wrote a letter that I gave to the Pope Francis, and I would like to share that with you now. I heard that the country of Iceland was planning to get rid of all humans with Down syndrome. I sent a YouTube video to the people of Iceland, and I gave a copy to this letter to the Pope Francis.
Okay.
I'd like to share that with you.
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Dear people of Iceland, my name is Bridget Brown, and I'm a young woman with Down syndrome. I absolutely love my life, and I am filled with joy to be alive. I'm so sad to hear about all the babies with Down syndrome who are aborted, and Iceland is leading the world in eliminating Down syndrome births. I am grateful that I was not aborted because I had a full and a wonderful life filled with love. The world needs to know that I do not suffer from Down syndrome. Most people with disabilities have a full and a productive lives, just like me. I believe in the sacred dignity of all people. I was devastated when I learned that during the Holocaust, Hitler killed many people because he thought they did not have the right to live. My heart broke again when I found out that Hitler learned how to kill people by killing people with disabilities first. This is genocide, a systematic killing of a whole people or nation. We think Hitler was so horrible, but we are doing the same thing that he did. I am filled with great sadness when I realize I might be the last generation of people with Down syndrome. The world may never again benefit from our gifts. I'll continue to hold hope for babies with disabilities. I will pray for all people of Iceland and people around the world who think we don't have the right to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget, so much. I love that letter. It was so clearly stated. And I love what you say about Down syndrome, people with Down syndrome having certain gifts, that Down syndrome itself being giving certain gifts to the world. What has been the response that you have received? What have people told you in response to this beautiful letter?
I really think specifically, they asked how is it that you're still living today? And I just say, well, my life is filled with hopes and possibilities. And even though that you don't know if you have a child with the Down syndrome firsthand, your life will never, your life will change because having a family member with a disability or with Down syndrome is a great thing. They have many gifts to share with the world.
Bridget, you talked in your letter and then just again about the gifts that people with Down syndrome have to share with the world. What do you think they are? What should we know about the gifts that people with Down syndrome can share with their communities and their parishes?
They have lots of capability of thinking, dreaming, their lives. They have a good heart. Yeah. And you could see that when you have children with Down syndrome, you could see those things. Yeah. Well, people with disabilities too. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You are a member of the Committee on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities for the NCPD. Tell us about the work of that committee, the Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Committee.
Sure. I have been on the Committee of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities for NCPD for many years. I get to know people from all over the country. I went to Rome with this group to meet with the Pope. He had international gathering for people with disabilities at the Vatican. He spent 2 hours with our group in a private meeting area. He individually blessed each and every person in the room. CIDD is made up of professionals, parents, and individuals with disabilities. We affirm that the dignity of every person and the work to provide meaningful participation of people with IDD of all cultures in every aspect of the life of the church. We provide resources and education that increase the opportunities for people with disabilities to be included in the congregation. In the U.S., I have a disability, and I am a national inclusion advocate. And so inclusion in the church for people with disabilities is very important to me.
Yeah. Bridget, you told us before we began today about a project to create welcome baskets for families who have a baby with Down syndrome to bring to the hospital. Tell us about this project. It sounds so cool.
I am on the board of the National Association for Down Syndrome, and they do a variety of outreach activities. They talk about nurses and doctors about new babies who are born with Down syndrome. They have a self-advocacy group called SAIA, that is Self-Advocate in Action, for adults with Down syndrome. And they have new baby welcome baskets, and they give to families who just delivered a baby with Down syndrome that includes fun things for the baby and information for families. They also connect new parents with a trained parent support mentor. They support moms with prenatal diagnosis.
That's really neat. Bridget, I just want to tell you, on a personal level, my daughter is 11, and you and your advocacy give our family so much hope, because I think for many parents of children with Down syndrome, the hope prenatally, but also as their children are young, is will they have a life with purpose and with meaning, in which they can be a witness to the gift of people with Down syndrome. And you are those things. And I was just my wife just sent me a text as she's watching this, just saying that she hopes our daughter grows up just like you, and I do too. So thank you so much for your witness and your advocacy. What else can you share with us? Is there anything you'd like to share with us about your own life with Down syndrome that people might misunderstand or have different perceptions of?
Sure. I was the first person with a disability included in my school, community, and church. I'm so blessed to have a full included from early intervention all the way through high school. Now, I am in a new inclusive program as students with disabilities at University of Illinois at Chicago, UIC. I am blessed because I have many champions in my life. A champion is a person who fights for or defends a person, a protector, advocate, and warrior. I have my own organization called Butterflies for Change. I'm the national public speaker and an inclusion advocate. I encourage people to open doors, minds, and hearts to include people of all abilities. The reason why I chose butterflies is because they are the symbol of hope. And I want to be a hope holder for others and encourage them to dwell in the possibilities. I want to help people with disabilities to include in schools, congregations, and live a full and productive lives. One dream of mine is that all Catholic churches and schools welcome people with disabilities into the areas of the church community. Often I have the opportunity to talk to Catholic schools. I always tell the story about how Jesus was preaching in a house with some friends came and lowered their friend who was disabled down from the hole in the room so he could meet Jesus. Jesus healed him. And I think he looked up at the friends peeking through that hole and gave them a thumb up sign and smiled. Because they were faithful to their friend, and I love them. They got to see Jesus perform miracles and become believers. They were the gospel in action and bring honor and thanks to God. I have a lot more to share, but I don't want to take up too much time. Thank you for listening.
Well, Bridget, you're going to be back to share more because as the questions are coming in, there are a lot of questions for you. So we're going to talk with Tracy for a while and then people have questions. And again, if you have questions, you can just click on that Q&A button close to the chat button and put your question. And we'll get to as many as we can after we've talked with Tracy for a little bit. Tracy, you work directly with parents as they receive a prenatal diagnosis. You walk with parents in an incredibly difficult moment in their lives, oftentimes when so many things are sort of stacked up against them. Tell us about how parents experience a prenatal diagnosis and where your work comes in.
Again, I think the issue really for most parents is the potential for this to be a traumatic event because they didn't understand the testing that they had agreed to have. That can be the case both with cell-free DNA tests as well as with even an anatomy scan. We think of the anatomy scan as really kind of just fun, another way to see baby, but oftentimes that's the beginning point for a diagnosis, let's say of a heart defect, that then results in the suggestion for genetic screening that leads ultimately to a diagnosis of Down syndrome. So parents are unprepared. When you have an experience that is unexpected, you feel like the rug's been pulled out from under you. The predictable life that you anticipated you had is gone. That can be threatening feeling. And additionally, like the idea that you have everything you need because now your life is very unpredictable and now what do you do and are you prepared for this is also really undermining to parents. And parents will say they felt helpless. So I feel like the biggest issue really is trauma. And then how do we support parents with trauma? I think a challenge for parents sometimes with a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome is, well, balanced information is great. Someone who's traumatized and bereaved can find information overwhelming. So sometimes that information has to be delivered at the right time. And it has to be delivered with a connection because we know that the antidote to trauma is connection. It's not surprising that we find so often parents who are living with a child with Down syndrome will say that they wish they had been connected to the Down syndrome community, the support groups and things that were available to them. It's because I think connection in the immediacy of the diagnosis is so important.
Yeah. That's a good reminder for parents of children with Down syndrome as well, because, my wife and I were just talking about the experience that we had that I think many disability families have, where at the beginning, we really did need those sort of disability organizations, the Down syndrome parenting groups and things like that. We needed to see it and experience the connection. And now that's, we don't feel that need, but it's easy for us to forget that there are people right now who do need it, right? So I think it's incumbent on disability parents to be willing to be connected, even when like what we have to do now is dance class and baseball practice and scouts and sort of ordinary family stuff. But I think there probably is a call for disability families to be involved in the kind of work that you do because of the normalization of that experience and the overcoming of trauma in their own family life.
I think too that not just disability parents, but trauma-informed care on the part of community providers and the church, that because oftentimes maybe the first person that hears about an atypical screening is the priest when a family shows up and asks for a blessing or asks for prayers around additional results that they're expecting. So it's really about everybody understanding how to respond in that moment.
Yeah, that's right. And what are some of the best resources for that kind of trauma-informed response when it comes specifically to a prenatal diagnosis?
We at Be Not Afraid have focused, let me say this, when you look at trauma-informed care, there's like 6 principles of trauma-informed care. They're rather complicated. We've focused on several, like limiting that number to make it more clear. I think connection is very important. A medical provider who connects immediately with the parents and starts relating to the parents one-on-one is important. It's important that they don't say, I'm sorry. It's appropriate to say, this is a difficult situation and I'm sorry you're going through this, but let's talk about this. I think committing to the baby, expressing community or belonging for baby is really important. And helping parents kind of anticipate next steps. You know, oftentimes the thing that you're robbed of when you have a prenatal diagnosis is that you haven't yet met the person who makes any challenge worth it, right? But once that baby's put in your arms, there's no doubt why you went through whatever you went through to get to that point. It doesn't matter whether that baby has Down syndrome or anything else. And so parents are denied that. Sometimes it's really important for parents to understand that the most important person is still missing and that person is still, we still commit to that person. That person is still part of our church community, or if you're a medical provider, a part of the medical community.
Yeah. Let's talk about the medical community, because I know you have a lot of knowledge about kind of disability bias in the medical community. We talked about that a little bit already, but talk to us about the research that kind of indicates what the research indicates about disability bias.
I think probably the most impactful thing I saw is that for every one parent who gets a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome that they think is positive, there are 3 who think that they had a negative experience. And the things that qualify as negative can be grouped either as implicit bias or explicit bias, but that can be everything from the use of negative stereotypes to not being able to provide accurate information, not being able to provide appropriate referrals or connections for parents, the substandard medical care that looks at as parents carried a term that looks at the infant with prenatal diagnosis in utero and believes that everything that infant might have going on is just part of their Down syndrome diagnosis without regard to other circumstances, looking at them as an individual, failing to do that. The presentation of the diagnosis as a death sentence, which is kind of surprising that anyone would find themselves in that situation, and then negative pronouncements regarding quality of life. I think that certainly in the trisomy, research around trisomy 13 and 18 is really clear about disability bias, and so much that we hear these conditions routinely referred to and misrepresented as lethal, to make it easier for parents to abort or to limit care before birth. Because really there is a quality of life judgment that living with significant to severe disability would be worse than being dead, which is kind of hard to imagine that medical providers would be in that situation, but that's the case.
Yeah. So what can be done, or what is being done for medical students and nursing students to help them become aware of, it's important, I think, for all of us to become aware of our biases. So what can be done to help medical nursing students to become aware of their own perhaps disability biases, and then to be better sort of trained for appropriate medical care for both people with disabilities and in the situation of a prenatal diagnosis?
I think that there's a lot of research. I mean, I think sometimes people think that there isn't enough data, or I don't know what to do and I'm not sure where to go, or I do what I do because somebody else did it and it worked. Yeah. There's a lot of data out there about what parents need and what benefits parents. We have a research page at our website, and there's a subsection on Down syndrome. There's a great article there specific to implicit and explicit bias in the medical community, rich with information and feedback from parents. Any doctor or nurse that's listening to this should go read that. I think that hearing parents' stories, but hearing them in the right context, can be really important. Medical providers need more exposure to individuals with disabilities. Certainly, there's been some research suggesting that genetic counselors are providing diagnostic information to parents, but maybe they've never met a person living with Down syndrome. That's an unfortunate reality. So I think there are resources out there. It's just a matter of connecting them with the right group at the right time. And oftentimes in the obstetric practices, they'll tell us they're busy. Prenatal testing is happening quickly. There's not enough time to do informed consent. But I think certainly for Catholic doctors, this is a consideration, an important consideration, because we know that we're called to express belonging to individuals with disabilities. And this is the first moment of doing that. And it can be so impactful in terms of helping parents make the decision to give baby time and to accept the child that God's sending to them.
Sure, absolutely. So, Tracy, people with Down syndrome are vulnerable to disability-selective abortion. You mentioned people with trisomy 18, trisomy 13. What are some of the other diagnoses that lead to a sort of prenatal vulnerability?
I think I would say definitely 13 and 18, and in some instances, it's primary brain anomalies, infants that have some structural issue going on with their brain. I think anytime there's the suggestion that a baby will have significant to severe disability, as is the case with 13 and 18, or that there's uncertainty, it's easy enough to label those as, lethal conditions. And then this push begins, as I said, to kind of limit care. We think of the children with Down syndrome as the primary threat to their life being the abortion that's offered at diagnosis, not inconsequential, not insignificant. But the kids with trisomy 13 and 18, they may survive that primary threat, the offer of abortion, and parents carry to term. But that the idea of lethality and the complication of limiting care continues with them for as long as they live. So they're much more likely to have the situation we saw 20 years ago, say with a child with Down syndrome, where there is a surgical intervention that's available for any other child, but we can't get a doctor to evaluate the child with trisomy 13 or 18 as an individual.
I think many people became aware of that for the first time during the pandemic when they started realizing where people with disabilities sort of faced and, the possibility of emergency health protocols and things like that.
Yes, definitely.
Have you seen since that time more of a push for reform or regulation on those issues?
It's slow going. I can't say that we've seen it in terms of, I think parents are more energized. I certainly think in the trisomy 13 and 18 community, the advances that have been made in the trisomy 21 community are something that they're looking to. The idea that parents can make a difference in the kind of care that is provided to their children, and that parents have a right to ask for better care and to insist on better care. Is it making a difference? I'm not sure. I guess a way to evaluate it would be that here in the United States, you have to have a hospital that is, we say trisomy friendly, that means 13 and 18. There may be 5 of those hospitals in the whole nation that would simply just look at a child with 13 or 18 and say, is this child a good candidate for this surgery? Rather than saying, nope, this child is not going to be evaluated for this surgery on the basis of their disability. And these conditions are conditions that are not lethal. The babies can live if provided with appropriate basic and sometimes extraordinary care.
So before I get to the questions from our participants, I'm just struck. We've offered a grim diagnosis, very honestly, that people with trisomy 21 and other disabilities face the grim prospect of abortion in utero, and subsequently continue to face sort of significant medical bias in terms of their treatment. I'd like to ask, if I can, to each of our panelists, what or where you see signs of hope with regard to the topic of our discussion today, the future of Down syndrome. Maybe I'll start with you, Mary, and then hear from Bridget and Tracy. But where do you see hope in terms of the future of people with Down syndrome in our world?
That's a great question, JD. In Evangelium Vitae, Pope St. John Paul II spoke of his absolute certitude, right, that in God's plan, life will be victorious. And so he encouraged us to look for signs. So it's good that we do that here. One sign for me has been, again, the 20 states, right, that have protections now for infants with Down syndrome. But an even greater sign, I think, is a very presence of those with Down syndrome among us, right? It's that we have our own Bridget Brown with us today, that there are self-advocates, right, who make a compelling case for an end to disability-selective abortion, right? How many of us could be so graceful if we were called upon to defend our lives? But I want to point out that it's not simply these highly capable individuals that give us hope. My son, for example, will likely never stand before you to give his testimony. He's duly challenged by Down syndrome and autism and some other neurological impairments. But it's his indomitable spirit and his embrace of life, despite his challenges, that keeps me fighting for all those children who are like him. He's an amazing, amazing young man. So that's my biggest hope, is that the lives of those with Down syndrome are good and beautiful, and they keep witnessing to that. And as long as there are some of these individuals among us, right, I don't think we can silence their voices.
Yeah. Bridget, where do you see signs of hope?
Hope gives us courage to take a chance in our future. Inclusion makes a big difference.
Amen. Yeah.
It can help people see their lives in a different framework. You think about how being included for people with disabilities, including autism and Down syndrome, to have friends, to be champions for each other, to be there to support one another. That is what inclusion is. It makes a lot of big difference.
Amen. How about you, Tracy?
Gosh, I'm writing this. I have a lot of things to say. I think that parents, incredible advocates, parents who speak from their heart, right? And advocates like Bridget are so powerful because they speak to the truth that oftentimes parents aren't hearing at diagnosis. And it's not that the medical community is all bad or evil. It's that they don't know what they don't know. If you've never met a Bridget, you have no idea really what you think. You're telling parents about the Down syndrome diagnosis. You have no idea if it's accurate or not. You're just doing it. So a lot of people are going through the motions. I think parents and advocates, APLOG and other organizations like APLOG, the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs, which are starting to look more at how they can support their membership in doing a better job around prenatal diagnosis, powerful. There's another organization that's trying to develop a pro-life genetic counselor certification program, powerful. I think the other thing is that, maybe less than a positive, more of an opportunity. When we look at Bridget is such a beautiful example of a communal response to disability that made a difference in her life. And that's what we're called to. So often I feel like Catholics think, I'm going to wait. Somebody else will be doing this work. Perinatal hospice is doing this work. Somebody else is taking care of people with disabilities. And it's fundamentally this challenging environment means that we have to do it. We have to step into it. We have to develop organizations that support families, and we have to reach out to families at diagnosis. So it's a really great time for us to think about what our responsibilities are around the issue of disability.
Yeah. I'd like to move into the questions from some of our participants. And again, participants, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. But you guys are asking a lot of great questions, so we'll see how many we can get to. One that struck me as very interesting is about autism spectrum disorder. So one of our participants says that prenatal testing right now for autism spectrum disorder is not especially precise, but there are reasons to think that accurate, non-invasive testing may soon become available. And so the question becomes, in a certain way, what having learned what we've learned about prenatal testing for trisomies, what can we sort of offer, wisdom can we offer to best sort of, for the autism community, for people who love people with autism, sort of best approach this issue right now before prenatal testing becomes widespread?
Mary, do you want to go first?
That's an excellent question. And what's really interesting is, I don't know if anybody read the article in The Atlantic several years ago called "The Last Children of Down Syndrome." And one of the obstetricians or gynecologists that was interviewed said that was a question that he kept getting from parents is, when is the autism test going to be available, right? And it's really concerning because LabCorp, right, which does the Maternity 21, one of the NIPS tests for Down syndrome, doesn't have a prenatal test yet, but they do have a genetic test for autism. And so I'm very concerned that this is where they're going to go next, right? And so, oh my goodness, it's difficult to even know where to start. I almost wonder, given the high incidence of Down syndrome, or excuse me, of autism, if this could be the tipping point, right, for prenatal diagnosis, because what are we going to do? Kill them all? Like, how many children are there with autism? But, I think that it's so interesting. Autism is such an interesting thing to look at because the path, right, from genome, right, from the genetic whatever markers to autism to the expression, right, to the phenome is so not straightforward. And so autism is an area in which early intervention makes a huge difference, right? And so there would be so much uncertainty around a diagnosis of autism. If you had some genetic markers or indicators of autism, that doesn't mean that that is going to be expressed, right? And you certainly don't know the level at which it would be expressed. And so I think that that community would be opening up a giant can of worms to try to pin down, genetic testing with any kind of certainty, let alone just the tragedy of losing these individuals. If you know that my son has Down syndrome and autism, and there can be challenges, but there are so many unique gifts. We're seeing this, the neurodiversity movement, which is proclaiming the goodness and the value of some of these gifts of people with autism. We're doing amazing things. We have Temple Grandin is probably the most famous example, but there are many individuals with autism. I know a priest, right, who has Father Matthew Schneider, who has autism, who brings his gifts. And so, the combination of uncertainty of outcome, but also on the other hand, the gifts of those with autism, which is so apparent, make it a direction that I really don't think we should go. And I really do wonder if we get to that point, if at some point this isn't what's going to make physicians just throw up their hands and say enough, right? Enough, right? We've lost enough lives already.
Thank you for that.
One can certainly hope. The only other thing that I would add to that, hindsight being 2020, is that oftentimes parents are given a diagnosis and a prognosis about baby without ever speaking to someone that treats living children with that condition. Yeah. And so perhaps communities that are looking at the propensity for genetic testing that would target their community, such as the autism community, might want to be thinking about how they insert that information, either provide it to parents or how they insert providers. Because that's one of the most powerful things. Parents frequently do not realize that the MFM, the maternal fetal medicine specialist, or the perinatologist doesn't treat children with heart defects, doesn't treat children with Down syndrome, doesn't treat children. And that should change what we think about the prognosis that we're getting from those people.
Yeah. Bridget, there's a question that you got in the comments that you sort of answered by text, but I think probably everyone would benefit from hearing about this. Bridget, what would be your response? What would you say to a mom who has just learned that her baby has Down syndrome?
Well, I would say make plans based on dreams and not on fears. Believe in yourself and your child.
Yeah. Thank you for that. One part of that struck me is dreams. Tracy, in your experience, and Mary, in your experience, oftentimes parents have to reset their expectations for what their family life will look like, for what their child's life will look like. What is the process of sort of helping a family to sort of reset their expectations when they receive a prenatal diagnosis, and where does that play into things?
I would say that, oftentimes the word suffering, somebody brought up the word suffering a few minutes ago, and this idea of uncertainty is what's used against parents. And the truth is, none of us welcome a child into our life that isn't going to suffer in one way or another. I wish that wasn't the case, and doesn't present a lot of uncertainty. So I think it helps parents at the time of diagnosis. If one thing that we say is slow down, this is not a medical crisis that requires a medical intervention, which would be terminating the pregnancy. This baby is the same baby you welcomed before. This is the baby you were happy about being pregnant with. This is the same baby. You just know more about this baby. It might be scary that you know some more, but you just know more. Yeah. And that we don't know enough information about your baby. And really what happens is you're going to have a baby, and you will adjust to life with that baby as that child grows. So often parents, regardless of what the diagnosis is, they're asked to imagine at the time of a prenatal diagnosis that they have a 12-year-old with whatever disability. They're going to have a baby, and it's their baby. And the face of disability on their baby is always going to be different than the face of disability on somebody else's baby. Yeah. And I love, trust in yourself. So often the messaging given to parents is, you're in trouble, you're in trouble, you're in trouble. The crisis is the birth of the baby with a disability, when in fact the crisis experienced by parents is the news that was unexpected and changes what they think they had planned for themselves.
Again, I will say we have gotten a couple of questions about just something which I mentioned very briefly, which is school inclusion, Catholic school inclusion. That's not the topic of our discussion today, but if you're interested in Catholic school inclusion, check out the NCPD's website, where they have a lot of resources about Catholic school inclusion. Check out the Fire Foundation, check out Inclusion Solutions. There are a lot of advocates and resources out there for Catholic school inclusion, and you can do it Catholic schools. But we're going to stick with prenatal diagnosis here for our last question, which comes from OSV News. And the question is this: what in your mind is the best sort of way to counter the flow of misinformation that parents receive? Is it these community connections? Are there other things? I mean, just what are the baseline things to counter misinformation at the time of prenatal diagnosis?
So I know in terms of information, I spoke about the information law, right? The Kennedy-Brownback law. What happened after that is a number of states got similar laws, or passed similar laws. And the only one that I heard of that was successful was in Massachusetts, where they linked the legislation to their first call program, so that at the time of diagnosis, that parents should be connected, right, with somebody in the Down syndrome community to receive information. And there was anecdotal stories coming out of that program where parents changed their mind, right, about abortion after meeting with other parents. So I think that meeting with other parents, right, around this time is very helpful, right? You talked about changing expectations, right? And I think that meeting other families who have children with Down syndrome can do this. So I think that's very important.
Thanks for that. I want to squeeze in one more question if we can. We're running close on time, but I think this is an important question that is really where the rubber meets the road. The connection between prenatal testing and abortion is strong. How should expecting Catholic couples be advised? Should they reject prenatal tests as a sort of prophetic witness? There are ways in which a prenatal test can be very helpful. I mean, what is your advice to expecting Catholic couples about just receiving the prenatal testing to begin with?
I would say that they need to think about prenatal testing, right, oriented towards the health of their child. And so if they think that would help the health of their child in some way, let's say, for example, that they are going to give birth in a rural hospital, right? They might be over 35, and there could be a risk, right, of having one of the trisomies. Then it could make sense, right, to get tested so that they could be fully prepared for their child. But I know Tracy can speak to this. In some cases, that's not helpful actually to know the diagnosis ahead of time. But I think the important thing is orientation, right, towards the good of their child.
Yeah, I think we should have this conversation early. There are some dioceses that are using a couple of brochures that Be Not Afraid produced in their pre-Cana programs. I think that this is something people should be thinking about ahead of time. It's a conversation to have before you start your obstetric care, and you kind of get into that routine of this is the test and we're going to just do it because that's what we do. I think it's also just important for parents to realize that they're not required to do the test, that any particular test could be declined. And that I certainly think the access to the NIPT calculator, we have it at our research page, our resource page, because of the false positives associated with that test, particularly for younger women, that probably, for me personally, is probably one of the more concerning tests, because it can be acted on as diagnostic by providers if a parent isn't prepared to pursue it, confirmatory testing.
Yeah. Thank you all so much, participants. I know you had a lot more questions and good questions. I wish that we had more time to be able to answer them, but I'm so grateful for the questions which you raised, and panelists, I'm so grateful for the expertise and witness that you have given. The title of our talk today is Prenatal Diagnosis and the Future of Down Syndrome. And we've seen two sides of that. We've seen the grim prospects that prenatal diagnoses suggest for people with Down syndrome and their presence in our world. And then we've seen the strength of the future of Down syndrome in our panelist, Bridget, and the advocacy that you do, Bridget, and the witness that you offer. So we have both a challenge and we have reason for hope. And that, I think, is so often the Christian life, and hopefully a call for all of us to continue working to defend the dignity of people with disabilities in the womb and out of the womb, and working to give witness to that, and to work for legal protection for that as well. So again, thank you so much, Tracy and Mary and Bridget, for the work that you do. And thank you for participants. Thank you, NCPD and Institute for Human Ecology, for sponsoring this. And I've been very glad to be with all of you.
Thank you, JD.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.